We'll now move on to the panel discussion, and I would like to thank the European Services Forum for partnering with us to make today's panel's discussion possible. And I would like to briefly introduce our panelists before we go on to discuss WTO GSI negotiations in more detail, but also the UK relationships. So our panelists today are Singapore's Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the WTO, Tan Hoon Seng, Christoph Kiener, Head of Unit for Services and Digital Trade in the European Commission, Nick Russell, Deputy Director of the Digital Trade Team at the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport in the UK, George Riedel, Trade Strategy Director at EY, and Pascal Carnis, Managing Director of the European Services Forum. Welcome to all of them. We've got about an hour for the conversation ahead, so a lot of ground to cover. So I won't take more of your time and head straight into the discussion and invite the ambassador to, I think everyone has turned on their cameras, and yeah, so we'd like to hear from you, Ambassador. Welcome, and in a dedicated panel this morning, obviously we have already extensively discussed DPA and DEA and Singapore's leadership in digital trade policy. So we think, of course, that a lot more can be achieved bilaterally than we'll ever, or regionally, than we'll ever be able to achieve at WTO level. But I was wondering if I can pick up from Ambassador Manley's keynote and get your assessment of the ongoing GSI negotiations and what sort of outcomes we can expect by MC12. Ambassador.
Sure. Well, first of all, very good morning, friends and colleagues. It's always good to see familiar faces, Simon and Christoph. Thank you for the invitation to this virtual panel. As mentioned by Simon, Singapore, together with Australia and Japan, are the co-conveners of the Joint Statement Initiative, or JSI for short, on e-commerce. Appreciate this opportunity to engage with the business community and other stakeholders today on this important track of work that we are undertaking here at the WTO. We value the inputs and the interest of the business community, because what we want to do must be commercially meaningful to all of you. We do not want the outcome to be merely a piece of paper. Let me just take a few minutes to give you the context and the latest state of play in the GSI negotiations. First, we continue to maintain our focus on streamlining the consolidated text. At this juncture, we can report modest but encouraging progress. We have clean text in two areas, in stamp and e-signatures. At the same time, we have also achieved good momentum on some other provisions, including consumer protection, open government data, e-contracts, and trading. You may have heard we have set ourselves an internal target to reach 10 clean articles by the summer break. And we remain cautiously optimistic that we can achieve maybe 5 or 6. Of course, we remain committed to a high standard, commercially meaningful GSI outcome. In this connection, strong rules on data flows, data localization, treatment of data for financial services, and source code will be important. For these issues, considerable work remains to be done to bridge the gaps at least 2 levels. At one level, we have to find convergence among proponents who take different approaches on data. For example, there are differences between the European Union and the CPTPP approaches towards data. To put it simplistically, the key differences boils down to a divergence in views on how exceptions to accommodate public policies objectives should be adopted. At another level, we have to bridge the differences between the proponents, those of us who are in the GSI, and those who may be more cautious about including data issues in the GSI. It goes without saying that we must work very hard to find landing zones at both levels. Between proponents who hold different approaches, we have begun facilitating conversations to help both sides gain a better appreciation of each other's positions and interests. The objective is to find common ground or convergence among the various proposals that are on the table. For those who do not support the inclusion of data issues, the focus is to raise the level of awareness concerning the importance of addressing data issues in the GSI. For example, at the plenary meeting last week, we organized an information session to help all members better understand the impact of digital protectionism and also to highlight regional best practices. So we included presentations by the OECD, by the Brookings Institute, and also Singapore's Infocom Media Development Authority. We hope that through such sessions, we will help to generate buy-in and lower skepticism, especially among developing members. Second, the three of us remain committed to report substantive progress by MC12. This is a milestone for the JSI. By that time, we hope to have more streamlined text, as well as identify key issues for ministers to provide guidance. MC12 will be an opportunity for ministers to demonstrate political leadership and provide impetus for future progress. We hope that a healthy status report on the GSI at MC12 will also send a powerful message that the WTO remains relevant and can address 21st century trade issues. Another objective that we have for MC12 will be to maybe agree on a realistic timeline for conclusion, which will inject urgency into the post-MC12 negotiations. I'll be very happy to hear your views on your expectations for the JSI at MC12. I have read from the statement that by ESF that you all hope that it will be concluded by MC12. I can say up front here that that is not going to happen. Third, we are committed to address concerns over the digital divide and development issues. These have come to the fore in the JSI discussions. While many JSI members recognize that the digital economy will play a critical role in driving post-COVID-19 economic recovery, they want to see more digital inclusion. We hope that the JSI can play an important role to catalyze domestic efforts to digitalize and to enable digital trade. This is also an issue that has captured the attention of our new Director General, Dr. Ngozi, who has urged JSI members to consider more seriously how we can address the digital divide. So we are committed to an inclusive outcome for the JSI, and we want to address the issue of development seriously. One of the objectives, besides allaying the fears and concerns of developing members, is also to blunt the recent efforts by India and South Africa to delegitimize the plurilateral initiatives at the WTO. Of course, our view is that there is no legal merit in India's and South Africa's assertions, and that plurilateral processes are kosher in the WTO. In fact, we see trilateral efforts as a tangible demonstration that the WTO remains relevant, useful, and meaningful to our stakeholders, including all of you, and that it can deliver results. I will stop here. I hope that these brief comments have given you a flavor of the ongoing JSI negotiations. As I've stated at the beginning, the business community, all of you, remains a very important stakeholder in supporting our efforts to push for substantive outcomes in the JSI, and we appreciate the partnership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Those are really important points. I've been taking loads of notes as you're talking, and it's good to see the kind of common ground with what Ambassador Manley was saying in the beginning of, what are some of the areas we need to focus on and what are some of the themes we need to focus on. And I particularly appreciated your points about the digital divide, and it's something we're launching this report in a couple of hours' time, and it's something we've also stressed a lot, that it's kind of important also for the UK to think of international trade policy in line with international development policy and in line with domestic policy. And I think they're often kind of siloed in conversation, and it's really important that I think you brought that up. And also I'm sure we'll touch upon many times over the discussion today on data flows. So I'll leave that for later and maybe turn to Christoph now. I'm sure he'll have thoughts on what he's just heard, but also Christoph, obviously the EU has been very supportive of the JSI negotiations from the very beginning, and you've been part of countless negotiating rounds. I'm just wondering, because for a lot of people following us today, they will know that the EU is a long-standing supporter of free and open trade, but they will also hear things like digital sovereignty or open strategic autonomy. So I was wondering if you could kind of maybe touch upon, like, how do we, what do we make out of those messages, and whether they are in any way contradictory or maybe not. Christoph, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Sabina, and thanks also for inviting me. Thanks to Pascal for making sure I had to face the challenge of speaking right after Simon and Hun Sen, two very eloquent speakers, so that's going to be tough. But I'm very pleased as well by the composition of this panel, because in addition to these familiar faces in the context of the WTO negotiations, I'm glad to see Nick. I haven't seen you for a while. Nick and I used to work or almost live together for a few months last year when we were completing the negotiation of the bilateral agreement between the UK and the EU. So it's a pleasure to see that you've upgraded your background, Nick, compared to last year. Anyway, just a few words from me, and I'll try to respond to your points, Sabina, as well. Important to understand, I think, that in reaction to what Hun Sen just said about the development, the need to ensure that we make up, or that we avoid the digital divide. It's very important to understand that the things we are negotiating in the WTO are actually the same things that we are negotiating in our bilateral free trade agreement. If you take the recent agreement again between the EU and the UK, the trade and cooperation agreement, you will see that the topics that are included in the digital trade title that we have in our bilateral agreements are very much the issues that Ambassador Tan has just listed, between electronic signature, customs duties on electronic transmissions, data, open internet access, consumer protection, source code, etc., etc. Now, obviously, not all these issues are equally important. That's quite clear, and we all know that data is the jewel on the crown, perhaps together with source code. But we also have the prohibition of customs duties. We would want to see a permanent ban of those when it comes to electronic transmissions. For the European Union, as I trust, but we'll hear from that. We'll hear from Nick about that. Also for the UK, the telecommunications sector is absolutely key. So we would there want to upgrade the set of rules that we have in the WTO reference paper. And indeed, Simon explained that the UK had already decided to co-sponsor the EU proposal for this. But what will be extremely important in that sector and in others is that these regulatory discussions are complemented by market access negotiations, and unfortunately that is not yet a given. So that, you know, puts together a very complex negotiating puzzle. 86 countries, as we have heard, about 40 issues on which we're negotiating, a handful of them being critically important in terms of their economic meaningfulness, so to speak. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy, particularly because in addition to, or in the process of developing a secure online environment for e-commerce, be it for companies or for consumers, individuals, of course, all the participants will need to preserve some policy space to domestic sensitivities. And it's well known that in the European Union, the question of privacy and the protection of personal data is absolutely key. And so that's, you know, the answer to those questions. The answers to those questions are not going to be that easy. That's why, indeed, I join Ambassador Tan in perhaps disappointing some of you and acknowledging that the negotiations will not be over by the end of this year. We will need a good push by ministers in order to get this process to the finish line. We've been negotiating formally for 2.5 years now. We have a 90-page long consolidated text full of brackets. So many negotiations round. Of course, in the online working environment, things get more slow. That's quite clear. But the good news is that participation is very constructive by everyone. And in particular, you know, it's interesting these days to have a forum where we have the US, the EU, and China, together with the UK, of course. But clearly, for the credibility of the process, we will need to make significant progress by the next ministerial conference. We've heard about the areas as well already. But as I was saying, ministers will need to give impetus to that process, particularly for negotiators to start tackling the issues that hurt. And again, data, source code, market access, the customs duties moratorium are such difficult issues. The importance, and just to get to my main messages for today, so that hopefully we can have some conversation afterwards. Beyond the fact that it's a real priority for the EU because of the economic importance of digital trade and electronic commerce, which are, you know, synonyms as far as we are concerned. Beyond that, I very much want to join Simon in his plea for people need to realize that the plurilateral negotiations on e-commerce will be the litmus test for the WTO's ability to deliver on new rules for the 21st century. Plurilateral avenues are the way forward. There is no other way. And so there is this rearguard battle by India and South Africa, but I certainly joined Ambassador Tan in his appreciation of those efforts. We absolutely need to make e-commerce a success in the WTO, because if we fail, that would be a very big blow to the very possibility for the WTO to develop rules in other areas like industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprise, and many other areas. And if we fail, that will only reinforce the existing trend that we see for the time being, where digital trade rules are primarily developed in bilateral and regional trade agreements. And that is obviously something that can lead to regulatory fragmentation, and nobody has an interest in doing this. Now, to avoid that kind of scenario, we indeed first need to agree within the WTO. Things, and this is why they're beautiful, they're never black, they're never white, things are always gray, and things are complex. It would be too easy, Sabina, to simply characterize the EU as the one making problems because we have privacy concerns, and because of that we cannot come to an agreement. As we have heard before, we have China in the room, we have Russia, Saudi Arabia, a number of countries that are not exactly enthusiastic at the prospect of having rules on open internet, the non-disclosure of source code or data localization requirements. This is the universe within which the proper balance will need to be found. And while I was saying that there is a lot of similarity between what we do in terms of scope in our bilateral agreement and in the WTO, we should also not fool ourselves. The WTO is never a place where you can get in one go to a level of ambition that is similar to the most ambitious free trade agreements that exist today. We will probably need to be a bit pragmatic in the level of ambition that we can have. We will need to inject some flexibility in the process, particularly for developing countries, but also with a view to cater for the sensitivities of the various participants. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Christoph. I think what kind of coming up of this conversation is a good dose of realism about what is achievable and by when, but also a message that the stakes are really high for these negotiations and for the WTO. So in a way, we kind of need to get them done, but also within a kind of reasonable time frame. It's not going to be by the end of the year if I'm taking the common thread of messaging that's come through so far. Nick, if I can turn to you now. Given the comprehensive digital trade chapter we've seen in the TCA, to what extent you think the UK and the EU can work together now bilaterally on the implementation of the TCA to start with, but also within the broader WTO negotiation to promote this vision that we've kind of agreed with each other. Nick.
Thanks, Sabina, and thanks for the opportunity to speak on the panel. And I feel like I'm going to add to Christoph's conga line of difficult speakers to follow, because it is very difficult. Now we've had Ambassador Manley, Ambassador Tan, and Christoph all express themselves so eloquently on so many good points. And it is a particular pleasure, Christoph, to be reacquainted in maybe slightly less fraught and frantic circumstances than we previously had some of our discussions in. But to answer, Sabina, your question about how we build on what we've done on the TCA and see it as a route to the in the JSI negotiations. I think to start with, an obvious point that's been made a few times is that there are 86 countries negotiating the JSI. If it was just the UK and EU negotiating the JSI, we could photocopy the TCA. If it was the UK and Japan, we could photocopy CEPA, and then we would be done, and it would be handshakes all round, and what an easy deal that was to do. The thing about most of these 86 countries as well is that most of these countries do not have not previously agreed FTAs that have digital trade chapters or e-commerce chapters in them. So for a lot of countries when we talk about Singapore or the UK or the EU, we all have a kind of a history of agreeing these types of agreements in bilateral deals. I think we have to recognise the fact that a lot of the countries there, we're asking them to take 4 or 5 steps at once, and with that, ambition is a real challenge. And I think we would be kidding ourselves if we were to imagine that, based on a pure legal reading of what the JSI would look like, that it would be as ambitious as the UK-Japan or UK-EU deals were, because that's just not feasible and not practical. And I think if we spend forever waiting for that, we will just be waiting for Godot in the end, and we will all time out before we get anywhere. But then there is this balance as well, because there's a scene on the Simpsons where Bart Simpson says that I can't promise to try, but I'll try to do something. And this is always my other worry, that we end up going so weak, we go to the try provisions, and we have language which, frankly, doesn't mean anything because it is so vague, it is so woolly, and it has so many caveats in it that we might as well all go home. So this is the really tricky sweet spot we have to sing. I think we can't be we can't be held hostage to our own ambition, but equally we have to do something that actually makes a difference at the end of the day. And that's why I think we probably need to be pragmatists, not idealists about this. And this is maybe where I would learn something from, I would reflect on both of the kind of two published UK trade deals on digital that we've done so far. If you look at the deal we did with the EU, the TCA, and the deal we did with Japan, CEPA, I think they're both very ambitious deals, but they also look very different on some of the key, most difficult talking points. If you look at the data language, it's very different in the Japan deal and the EU deal. If you look at the source code language, again, it is very different. But ultimately, both achieve what we would see as quite similar things: strong safeguards with very targeted exceptions where the public policy need has really been justified by both sides. And for us, that's I think where we would see our role in these talks, and how we would want to encourage others to look at it too. That we shouldn't worship at the altar of a specific legal text or a way of formulating discussions, but instead we should think about actually what's needed from these talks, and what does, at the end of the day, what matters to businesses and those who are actually doing the cross-border trade between them. So I think we should be pragmatists, not idealists. I think we should not sacrifice all of our ambition, but we should realise that ambition is needed, and I think we should be listening as well to businesses, and we should be having businesses be the engine behind it a little bit too. I think agreeing with everyone beforehand, there is going to be no deal at MC12, but there is also no harm in business groups and other groups trying to push us as quickly as possible and making sure that we don't drop our guard here. So I think there's a really important role, Sabina, for techUK, for its members, in kind of being the fire underneath our heels in trying to get these deals done.
Thank you so much, Nick. And yeah, exactly. That's what we're trying to do today, and in the WTO Public Forum, and in all kinds of opportunities there exist to kind of keep raising the points of view of the industry. And I know Pascal is doing the same on his end. And there is a number of kind of industry groups from around the world that are kind of involved in kind of making the points and stressing out the points that these negotiations are important, and what are some of the things that will make a deal commercially meaningful. So I think now that we are talking about what matters to business, is probably a good time to turn to George. Obviously, the services sector dominates the UK economy. And yet, as a country, we are famously underutilizing trade agreements, especially our SME community. Even when we were in the European Union, after we left, we are not really making the best of these trade agreements. So I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts of what should absolutely be in this WTO GSI deal whenever it does happen. Definitely not by the end of the year, but whenever it does happen, and what would make it commercially meaningful, especially for maybe smaller market players. So George.
Thanks, Sabina, and thanks for the invitation to join the panel today. A real pleasure to be here with sort of, as others have said, familiar faces. To follow on from Nick's point, I'd like to just state that, yeah, get it done. That is a clear message from the business community that, and in particular, one of the reasons for that is during the pandemic, we have seen a trend towards digitalization absolutely accelerate across nearly every sector of the economy. I know we used to have technology companies and everyone else, But increasingly, you know, every company, if it is to be a viable company and provide its goods or services, there is going to be a technology and digital aspect to that presence. It is almost inevitable now across every sector of the economy. And, you know, some great examples of that are, you know, a lot of attention gets put on the fintech community here in the UK and what's happening around that in the City of London. But there's really exciting things happening in law tech. The accountancy profession is going digital. You are seeing sort of traditional service providers becoming much more savvy when, you know, looking at sort of technology solutions in terms of how they provide those services, but also on their online presence and engaging with clients and customers around the world. So these are trends that aren't going away. And I think the past year has really accelerated them. Where, you know, it's always good to self-reflect and say, you know, how should we be engaging as the business community? And I think, you know, there is a lot more that can be done there. Showing up once a year at the WTO Public Forum and, you know, providing a bit of input just isn't enough, I think, in today's modern world, and in particular how these negotiations are progressing, given they're discussing such important issues. As you say, the commercially meaningful ones are the most difficult. They end up being source code, they end up being data flows, they end up being sort of the customs duty moratorium. So those issues that others have mentioned are the ones that, you know, the business community is typically most interested in. And I think it's one of those points around business engagement that the B7 made in their recent recommendations around the business community being more engaged going forward and not just being a one-off event every year, which, you know, certainly does need a bit more work. I think the other thing where the business community, I think, can really add value is, and in working with the WTO, is around the cut across to other negotiations. I know we like to talk about e-commerce and, you know, domestic regulation over here and investment facilitation and maybe environmental services in the future, but increasingly all of those components are linked. A lot of the domestic regulations provisions will have an online component now. You know, the digitalization of environmental services is absolutely key to how companies are looking to decarbonize and become more sustainable as well. So, you know, I would definitely encourage a more joined up approach across those negotiations, given the importance of the issues, and also bringing that across to the regular work of the WTO. We do have a mechanism under the CTS to notify new measures related to services. We could be doing a lot more to use that functionality of the WTO outside of the negotiations to really drive forward those 21st century issues as well. So certainly a lot that can be done there. And then finally, I think, you know, in terms of bringing other countries on board, yes, there are obviously concerns that we've heard, but when you talk to businesses in those countries, you know, they don't really care about a plurilateral approach or a multilateral approach. What they're caring about is the regulatory frameworks being in place in those countries. They care about the capacity both of the private sector and the regulators to make sure that they're shaping their digital ecosystem in a way that really enables their businesses. So I think focusing there is a real positive for selling how these negotiations will benefit the business community. I've covered a couple of different topics, so I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, George. And obviously, regulatory cooperation has kept coming up again and again today in our conversations this morning on DEPA and DEA, of course, as kind of setting up the gold standard in, you know, how we get countries to work together. We've seen some very interesting project presented by by Australia this morning about how regulators on both sides and customs officials on both sides and digital companies on both sides are working together on a kind of a blockchain solution for identity verification at the border. So very interesting new developments in that space, but definitely regulatory cooperation keeps coming up. Another point that I'll take from what you just said is the link to environment. I think, maybe a year ago, we were talking about digital trade when we launched our first report. It was very much a kind of, we do our, how do we define basically digital trade policy? What's the digital trade chapter going to do? What are some of the other services provisions that will help? I think increasingly we see a lot of the conversations around digital trade and data and the environment and the impact on the environment. So, one of the big highlights of our new report that we're launching in an hour's time is, this whole new chapter on digital trade and the environment, and what are the kind of policies we need to get right to kind of limit our impacts on the environment. So yeah, and I really liked your kind of start of the conversation, which was get it done. So I think we'll take that as a message. I'd now like to turn to Pascal, who's obviously partnered with us today to do this panel. Great to have you here, Pascal. And maybe I think a topic to pick up on, which has been raised by the other panelists, is how do we get more industry voices into the conversation? And you've been doing a lot of that work, so I'll pass on to you for the tips and tricks.
Thank you very much, Sabina, and thank you for techUK allowing ESF to join this big event, and thank you for all the panelists who've been putting forward very interesting issues that I support, nearly all of them, and very much what George mentioned about the business priorities. Indeed, there is an increase of digital trade restrictions globally, and maybe I'd like to highlight some few studies or places where the audience can find some information on this, because I think it is really important to realize that there are an increased number of trade barriers. First of all, I'd like to mention the OECD Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, the digital STRI, which is really a very useful tool. You also have the Esib Digital Trade Restrictiveness Index, which had been done last year. And I think Martina is going to join us in the afternoon. It's a huge work of 130 pages and more, having 100 categories of policy measures, as it is put it there, across 64 countries. So also very good tool to look at. In there, you can see that the top 10 countries which are putting barriers to digital trade are China, Russia, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, then also Brazil, Turkey, Argentina. But the top 9 is actually France, which is a member of the European Union, and also then Thailand. So these countries are the top 10. There are many others which are raising new barriers, and maybe there is a need to really highlight that there are these barriers. I'd like to also mention another tool which is going to come soon. It's part of the Global Trade Alert, and this is Simon Evenet from the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, who is putting into place a digital policy alert. It is going to be done later this year, but it's going to be to build a public and independent searchable tool with the record of the different policy changes, and they would be searchable, etc. So highlight and everything will be highlighting where the cross-border digital trade is affected by these different measures. So you put the question, but what can more the industry do to highlight the danger of protectionism in digital trade? I was very happy to hear Ambassador Tan saying, in the last session in Geneva, we have got this discussion about trade protectionism. I think we need to develop a bit more what it is, because some countries do not realize that what the impact of the measure on their own economy. Because when we talk about localization requirement, when we talk about compulsory licenses to give the source code or to give the algorithm, probably they can say, well, that has an impact on increasing the cost of foreign companies doing business in our country. So it's just affecting foreign business. That is not at all the result, because I think it needs to be said that the increase of cost of foreign companies is going much further than that. It will create, and I would say this is also what we notice in all different barriers for the services sectors trying to do business abroad. And the example of the equity cap or joint ventures requirement, a services company is not a manufacturing company. A services company is providing a service which is consumed immediately, and therefore you cannot slice down the supply chain like you can do for goods. And therefore the impact on services in digital trade is much more important. That creates lack of investment. This lack of investment creates lack of creation of jobs, creation of local wealth. So these countries are suffering themselves. And that is also igniting a lack of access to innovation. So it's a vicious circle, and that is, it needs to be said, this is increasing the digital divide. So maybe one of the answer to WTO DG Ngozi is to tell her the way to reduce digital divide is actually to increase market access to foreign companies, increase foreign direct investment, and that is not the reverse. So countries need to be aware about that. Another way which I think needs to be done. We have heard about many bilateral trade having digital chapters, digital trade chapters, etc. But I think there is also a need to spread out a proper functioning regulatory cooperation between the authorities, including within the countries which have already signed some chapters on e-commerce or digital trade, where actually there are some regulatory cooperation in place, but actually not that much, and very few on the crucial subject, which is data flow, cross-border data flow, and data protection regulation. That needs to be said, and we hope that countries will come together and at the table to do that also. So another thing that business, of course, need to do is to encourage the industry to support the GSI and to support the bilateral trade on agreement. But coming back to the WTO Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce, who else, if not the industry, would ask to get a fast result? So George said, please do it. We did in our position paper that we want to have a result by MC12. But we, of course, we are also realistic, and we know that it cannot be done like this. But we are very hopeful to see progress being expressed at MC12. If indeed you could give a realistic deadline, that would be also more than welcome. But also business is also realistic, and I think we need to say that we don't want to come into, as it has been the case for the last 20 years in WTO, to come to another situation of blockage, which means that we went to, as Christophe said, to the plurilateral mechanism, which is into the WTO, a group of countries want to go faster than others. And that means that we have created now a tool to avoid to be blocked by a veto right. Now that we have this tool, we hope that these 86 countries would like to move ahead, and if not all of them can please do something to have, I don't know what, a two-tier approach, to have those who want to go faster and further have the possibility to do so, open the gate and open the door to allow countries to join later, but do not stop the machinery because one of them or a group of them don't want to do that. So making, I hate the special trade treatment, but something like that to have a progression and transitional periods. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pascal. Loads of really good points in there, and I'm sure we'll kind of slowly pick up on them as we move into the conversation. I'd just like to remind the audience that you can ask questions through the Q&A function that you see in your, I think, right-hand side corner. So please do so, and we've already had a couple coming through the chat. So I think I'll turn back to Ambassador Tan and Christophe on this one. There is a question around the market access negotiations, and the person asking the question is wondering, what do you see as kind of the key milestones ahead for that part of the negotiation? So I don't know, maybe Ambassador Tan, maybe start with you.
Thank you for that question on market access. Maybe I can leave the details to Christoph on that. But I just want to pick up a few points that have been raised. One is concerning the role of industry business community. And I understand that market access is an important issue. And I also take very well Pascal's point that, one way to bridge the digital divide is really to enhance market access, which will in turn generate more foreign investment, which will in turn create jobs. So I think the business community has a very important role to play because you have a global footprint, and more importantly, you have a presence that make a real impact on the ground in many countries. So please use that presence to advocate, to lobby. I think that kind of activities would be much more impactful than issuing position papers. To give you a very real-life example, you look at India. The Indian economy is highly digitalized, but why are they taking such an obstructionist position at the WTO? I think there is an inherent contradiction or pulls between the interest of business and the interest of the bureaucracy. For the bureaucracies in many developing countries, the word which we hear too often, Christoph and I will always roll our eyes, is more policy based. The question is, more policy space to do what? So these are the kind of issues and challenges that the business community can deliver to your host countries on market access issues, on data issues. So I think I will stop here, and maybe Christoph can address the more technical issues of market access.
Thank you. Yeah, Christoph.
Thanks a lot, Sabina and Hun Sen. I'll be happy to at least do my Homer Simpson and try. Market access is extremely important for the European Union and has been identified as one of our most important offensive area of interest in all our contacts with industry, private sector stakeholders, and I would certainly echo Hun Sen's call for even more engagement by private companies, be it through ESF, which is doing a fantastic work in this regard in Brussels, or directly coming to lobby the various participants in those negotiations. You need to make your voice heard. This is very, very clear. The opponents are always the ones who are very vocal, and we tend to focus on that. And political economy being what it is, it's always a trap in which governments tend to fall. We need the silent majority of those who support further opening of trade to be heard as well. This is important these days. On market access, therefore, after lengthy consultations with our member states, our industry, etc., we came with a formal proposal, a formal request in Geneva to start market access negotiations for both services and goods. When it comes to trading goods, we would wish to see all the participants in the GSI join the existing agreement on information technology and its recent expansion. And when it comes to services trade, we had lengthy discussions within the EU, and we chose to opt for an approach that we sort of streamlined our request in order to focus on those two sectors which we thought were the most relevant for the development of digital trade. And the two services sectors that we thought were most relevant for that are telecommunication services and computer services. Now, we have initiated on that basis a series of bilateral contacts, but also in small groups with potentially interested members. And there is a small group of WTO members which is now openly in favor of market access negotiations. The difficulty is, of course, as always, in the details, but this is what makes it interesting. The difficulty is that some of the participants would want to see a much broader scope of market access negotiations. And, you know, some have even put on the table the idea that an essential component of any e-commerce negotiation would be the liberalization of maritime transport services. Now, as EU, I have nothing against that. We're also very offensive on maritime transport. We're very competitive. We know how important it is. But I fail to see the very direct link between digital trade and maritime transport. Of course, I'm not stupid. I know that a lot of people order goods online that have to be shipped from China, for example. But, you know, if you take such an expansive approach, then everything is digital, because banking services are mostly digital today, and everything goes via a computer, even conferences like this. We can't even have cocktails afterwards, except on our own at home. It's a bit sad. But so we think that in order for us to be able to come to a successful outcome, it will be very important to focus the market access negotiations on those sectors that are really essential. That is also, by the way, the only possibility to get there, because in the WTO, we are bound by, you know, what is called the MFN principle. We need to extend the same preferences, the same treatment to everyone when it comes to market access, and particularly for trade in goods, because you eliminate tariffs there. This is a very tricky thing to do, and the idea that we could open up very widely towards everyone in the context of a short negotiation only on e-commerce is very misplaced.
Thank you, Christophe, for that overview. And, you know, we've kind of seen one country kind of named throughout this conversations, and that is India. I know the UK is about to kind of launch, you know, trade negotiations and potentially an enhanced trade agreement with India. Obviously, as a sector, unlike most of the other trade negotiations that the UK is doing, that is a country that poses a lot of problems from a digital trade perspective, and generally from a kind of domestic regulation on tech and digital. So I'm wondering if you see, maybe Nick, if you see an opportunity to kind of, you know, influence India and kind of bring it more in line with the conversations of the WTO through this bilateral negotiation, and how much do you actually believe is achievable in that space? I know that's not exactly you know, the topic of the WTO conversation today, but I thought, you know, as everyone kind of mentioned India throughout, I thought this is probably a good time to bring in. So Nick.
Thanks, Sabina. And, you know, obviously, India are not playing a role in the JSI negotiations, and, you know, we would see their position on that as regrettable. But as I was talking, when I talked earlier about how we approach the JSI negotiations, you know, I was talking that we're pragmatists and not idealists. And I think when we look at an India free trade agreement, and you'll have seen what the UK government's announcements on that in recent months, that you know, I think we have to realise that the types of digital trade barrier that we face that British businesses face in India are very different from those that we would potentially face in the EU or in Singapore or in Japan. They are often potentially more real than theoretical, which you know, I think ups the stakes of this kind of game a little bit more. So what I think we would want to do is not necessarily just pull off a kind of a copy off the shelf of this is how we've done free trade with every other country. But again, I think that the consultation phase of this is going to be really important to understand actually where these barriers are and where we can pinpoint them. I would also say though that there isn't. I wouldn't like to paint a picture that these negotiations are going to be entirely difficult. And indeed, for me, free trade agreements are they're antagonistic in a way. Both parties are trying to get the best from themselves, but they're also written from a position of friendship and partnership as well. And as with say every other negotiation, there will be parts in our discussions with India. For example, we've been having some really fruitful bilateral conversations on our telecoms markets with India recently, and how we can help open up access to each other's telecoms markets a bit more. Telecoms trade, by the way, is an area that I feel sometimes gets underplayed in the wider digital trade discussion, both on these bilateral deals and actually at the JSI and the efforts we're making there. So I would highlight, yes, there are challenges with India. Yes, we've got to approach them in a slightly different way, and I think we need to take businesses' views on that. But that deal is being done in a spirit of kind of cooperation and friendship, and an overall picture of let's get something done, and let's also see areas that we can cooperate and go further on.
Thanks a lot, Nick. Obviously not entirely difficult. It's just for the tech sector, we've kind of had it easy till now, as we tend to kind of agree with everything that Japan is doing, or it's kind of it's more common ground with EU, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and the other countries that we're negotiating agreements with. So slightly more difficult from a digital trade perspective than the previous agreement. So that's the comparison term, as opposed to it being entirely complicated. I think we're approaching the end of time. So what I'd like to do now is kind of take the panel the other way around and kind of ask you all maybe for a call to action. You'll have on the call today, businesses from small to large. You'll have stakeholders, so government stakeholders. You'll have academia. You'll basically have everyone kind of interested in digital trade policy. This particular conversation of the WTO negotiations, the EU-UK relationship. So I'm wondering, if you could take just a few seconds as a kind of call to action to our audience today before we close for lunch. So Pascal, if I can start with you.
Well, I will say clearly, since we have two ambassadors and the chief negotiator of the EU here, that get your act together and deliver something, maybe not as a result in MC12, but at least give us a clear pathway towards a positive result, and be realistic. Thank you. Thanks,
Pascal. George, echoing that?
So definitely echoing that, but to probably at a slightly different point, I think really important, and this is for government colleagues, that we need to do a better job at explaining how companies can use free trade agreements, and also sort of the benefits of what is being negotiated in Geneva, because I don't think it's very well understood often. And then for businesses, I'd say we need to get more involved, and certainly, great start here today, but it needs to be a continued and sustained effort.
Thanks a lot, George. Indeed, I think we're increasingly seeing that convergence of trade policy and trade facilitation in our work as well, which is great, as they kind of have to go hand in hand. Nick.
Thanks, Sabina. I'd like to build on actually what you and George just said there, which is trade facilitation. We haven't talked about today, but it's really, really important. And what we want to know is the actual nuts and bolts, the actual problems that you are facing that we can help make easier, because we can help make them easier. And I would point to some of the stuff we've been doing at the G7 on digitizing bills of lading and electronic transferable records as a real example of where we are able to do that for businesses. But we need to hear from you about what those problems are. Come to us, be clear, tell us the details, and we'll see what we can do about it.
Thanks a lot, Nick. I'm sure that was well heard and noted. Christoph.
I'd just like to agree with Nick. In the past, I used to say that we often felt we were stuck in our little ivory towers of the Commission buildings. and that we needed to interact with business. Now we're not even in our offices in the Commission buildings anymore. We're stuck at home. It makes it all the more difficult. So whatever the way, whether it's by means of a position paper, whether it's by means of a phone call, emails, tell us what your problems are, because indeed, at the end of the day, those negotiations are there to serve your interest, to facilitate your life, enter into new markets, and not for the sake of us spending hours and hours either on mission in the past and perhaps tomorrow, and currently in online teleconferences. Thanks.
Thanks, Christophe. And Ambassador Tan.
Well, very briefly, I want the business community to stay engaged and not lose faith. I can promise you that we will do our best to deliver a meaningful outcome. As Christophe had said, it's a litmus test for the WTO, and we can only do it in partnership with all of you. We are conscious that the negotiations cannot go on forever. Otherwise, we may end up with a meaningless piece of paper 5 years down the road because we have been overtaken by the rapid pace of digital transformation. So yes, we are working hard. So keep engaged, keep the faith. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. That's a wonderful note to end this panel on. And I would like to thank the European Services Forum again for supporting this panel, and thank all the speakers for being here. I think that was a very interesting conversation, a lot to take on and a lot of work to do. I think both on the government and negotiation side, as well as on our side in the business community, to keep making this point and raising our voices in these conversations. I'd like to thank you again and remind you that we are now going on a lunch break, and we will be back at 1:10 UK time for the launch of our new digital trade report, a blueprint for UK digital trade. So see you at 1:30. Thank you very much.